One sunny morning, students filled a classroom, chatting excitedly about their day. The professor, a wise and kind man with glasses, entered the room and everyone became quiet. He smiled at his students and said, "Today, we will have a surprise test." The students were surprised. They hadn't studied for a test, and some of them felt nervous. They all took their seats and looked at the professor. He seemed calm and ready. The professor told everyone to get ready and pay attention. He then began handing out a test paper to each student. Everyone took the paper quietly, wondering what was going to happen next. The professor spoke again. "Keep your test paper face down until I tell you to turn it over." The students nodded, waiting for instructions. After a few moments, the professor finished handing out the papers. He said, "Now, turn your papers over." The students flipped their papers, and to their surprise, there were no questions. There were no problems to solve. Instead, there was just a blank sheet of white paper, and in the center of the paper, there was a small black dot. The students looked at the dot, confused. What was this? What did it mean? They looked at each other, wondering if anyone else knew the answer. Some students started scribbling on their papers, trying to write something about the dot. Others stared at the paper, thinking hard. The professor watched them for a moment, then said, "I want you to write about what you see on the paper. Write your thoughts about the dot." The students, still unsure, began to write. Some described the size and location of the dot, while others wrote about what they thought the dot represented. They wrote their thoughts down as best as they could. The test lasted for a while, and when the time was up, the professor asked everyone to hand in their papers. The students sat quietly, waiting to see what would happen next. The professor collected all the papers and looked through them. He began to read the answers aloud, one by one. It quickly became clear that every student had written the same thing. They all described the black dot. Some wrote about where it was on the paper. Some wrote about how big or small it was. Others tried to guess why it was there. But no one had written about the rest of the paper, the white part. The room was silent as the professor finished reading the last answer. The professor looked up and smiled gently. "Thank you for your answers," he said. "But I'm not going to grade this test. There is something important I want you to think about." The students were curious now, wondering what he meant. The professor continued, "You see, every one of you had a white sheet of paper in front of you. And on that paper, there was a small black dot. But instead of writing about the white part of the paper, you all focused on the black dot." The students looked at each other, realizing the truth in what the professor was saying. The professor paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "Life is like that blank sheet of paper," the professor said. "Most of our lives are filled with good things, with blessings and happiness. But instead of focusing on the good things, we often focus on the small problems and challenges. We focus on the black dots." The students listened closely, thinking about their own lives. The professor continued, "We have so much to be grateful for. We have our families, our friends, and our health. We live in a beautiful world with nature all around us. But instead of feeling thankful for all the good things, we often worry about the small problems, maybe a little pain in our body, or money we don't have, or a fight with a friend." The students nodded, beginning to understand what the professor meant. He smiled and said, "The black dots in our lives are like small challenges. They are there, but they are not as big as we often make them seem. If we focus only on the black dots, we miss all the wonderful things around us." The professor stood up and walked around the room, looking at his students. "Think about it," he said. "We have so much to be thankful for, so much beauty in our lives. We can enjoy a quiet walk in the park, a good book, a moment of rest, or a kind word from a friend. These are the white parts of life. The students were quiet, reflecting on the professor's words. They had never thought about life in this way before. The professor smiled again and said, "The black dots are small compared to everything else in our lives. But we often let them take up too much space in our minds. We need to remember the white parts, the good things we have." He paused and then added, "Sometimes, we only realize how lucky we are when we see someone else who doesn't have what we do. Maybe we see someone without a home, and it makes us thankful for our house. Or we meet someone who can't see, and it makes us appreciate our sight. We often forget to be grateful for what we have until we see others who don't have it." The students were thinking about this. They could see how true it was. The professor continued, "It's natural to focus on problems, but we can train ourselves to focus on the good things, too. It doesn't mean we ignore our problems, but we learn to see the good things alongside them. If we do that, we can feel more happiness and peace in our lives." The professor paused and looked at the students with kindness in his eyes. When we choose to focus on the good things, we feel better. We feel happier. We feel stronger. And when we appreciate the good things, we can handle the black dots in our lives much better. The students sat quietly, taking in what the professor had said. It was a lot to think about. They had learned something important that day. The professor spoke once more, "I want you all to remember this lesson. Life is like a sheet of paper, mostly white, with a small black dot. It's easy to focus on the black dots, but don't forget about all the white space, the good things, the blessings, the moments of joy." The students left the classroom that day with a new way of thinking. They looked at the world around them with more gratitude. They began to notice the small things that made life beautiful, the warmth of the sun, the laughter of friends, the quiet moments of peace. From that day on, the students tried to remember the professor's lesson. They worked to see the good things in their lives, even when problems came their way. They learned that life was about finding balance, recognizing the challenges, but also appreciating the many blessings. And in doing so, they found more joy, more peace, and a greater appreciation for the beautiful white space in their lives. Thanks for being part of the community. If you've made it to the end of this video, you're lucky because you might be the next one I mention in the next video. If you'd like a shout out, just drop a comment with your location and I'll include you. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more content.